Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. My name is Mónica Ortiz Uribe. Today I'm excited to host a dear friend and celebrated author here on the border. His name is Benjamin Alire Sá, and he's the chair of the Creative Writing Department at the University of Texas at El Paso. Benjamin has 19 published works to his name, including children's books, novels, and poetry. He made big news just a few weeks ago. He was honored with one of the biggest national literary awards in the country, and his book, Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club, won the Faulkner Award. It was selected among 351 entries for this prestigious award. Welcome, Benjamin. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here in my hometown.
Ah, right. So tell us, you teach at UTEP, but you were born here in New Mexico, just outside of Las Cruces, right?
Yes, there's a little village right west of Mesilla called Old Picacho. Small little village, and I was born in my grandmother's house. My grandmother was a midwife, so she literally brought me into the world. And I lived in a rural community. I grew up on a farm.
And what did your parents do? Tell me about your family life.
My father was a cotton farmer. My mother was busy raising 7 kids. And we lived very humbly. But I really have fond memories of growing up on a farm, because we just roamed freely. And we didn't have, our neighbors weren't close. We didn't have a next door neighbor like you do in the city.
Okay. Well, when did you first pick up a book?
Oh, I first picked up a book. I think I played with them. And comic books. I had older brothers and sisters. But the minute I entered school, I fell in love with books. And we used to have this thing called the Weekly Reader. And the Weekly Reader was this little newspaper for kids. But in the Weekly Reader, there was these cheap paperback books that you could order. And they cost 35 cents or 25 cents. And we never had any money. But my Uncle Willie, who lived with my grandmother and worked, if I asked my dad for $1, that was asking him for a lot. But I could ask him for $1. And sometimes I could order 3 books. And then I would just sit and read them. And I just was always in love with books.
Yeah. And so were you a reader very early on then? And did you continue that?
Very early on. I didn't always read what I was supposed to be reading in school, but I was reading. In fact, I remember in history class, I was reading some novel. I sat at the back of the classroom, and the history teacher confiscated the book because she says, "Now, this isn't a history text, now is it, Mr. Sines?" But I think they all appreciated the fact, all my teachers appreciated the fact that I really loved books.
And so did you know early on that you would make a career out of this love for books and with writing?
No, I knew I was good at it. I didn't give that a second thought. I remember in high school, we were supposed to write a short story, and I wrote one. And I remember the teacher telling me, "There's something in you, young man." And, I wasn't that concerned about it. I was always good at writing. I was always happy when we had an essay test instead of a multiple choice. There was just something, I could just articulate myself on the page, and I could think on it, on something. So it was easy for me to do that. And when I got to college, it was great that I had that skill, because we had small classes, and all of our exams were essay exams. And therefore, I had the advantage because I liked writing, and papers too. everyone seemed like it was such a chore. Oh, we have to write this paper and this and that. I thought, this is great. I could just pull everything together when I was doing my research, and somehow I could pull it all together. I could get this information from here and here, and my mind worked that way, and then I could organize it. But it wasn't as if I ever did outlines. I didn't outline papers. I just could get all the information and organize it in such a way that it made sense. And I always had that skill.
So a lot of the border plays a big part in almost all of your work. Can you talk about growing up on the border, and did you have a very a vast experience crossing back and forward and with the U.S. and Mexico?
Actually, yeah. Probably a lot of people had more, but for instance, when we lived on a farm, my father would pile us all in the truck or the car, and we'd make the trek to Juarez, and we'd all get our haircuts. We always got our haircuts in Juarez, and there was another family that went with us. They had a lot of boys too, and we'd spend most of the day there, getting our haircuts. My father would do shopping. He'd buy meat, get some provisiones to take home, and we would just like play out in the streets, with the other kids. And so it was a very common thing. I mean, I knew we were in another country, and it was different than where I lived. But the farm was the farm that I grew up in, it's quiet. It's a lot of work, but it's quiet. Yeah. And I loved when we would take the old highway, and we would pass through Segundo Barrio, and then park the truck and walk across the Santa Fe Bridge. The minute we hit Paisano Street and crossed to Segundo Barrio, there was so many people, and the streets were full of Spanish, and I thought that was the most wonderful thing in the world. That experience as a boy.
So, so then when you turned 18, you veered off in a different direction, and entered into seminary. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I decided that maybe I was called to be a priest. In the end, I was wrong, but sometimes you don't know you're wrong until you do something.
What led you to think that maybe that was the path that you needed to be taken at that moment?
Well, I was very involved in a Catholic youth retreat, and all my friends, we would go to these retreats, and we would be like the leaders of the retreat when we got involved. They were called Search for Christian Maturity, and they were weekend retreats. And I became kind of a leader there, and we would give talks, and we'd run the whole show. It was kind of peer-led. And, and I came from a very religious family. And also because at the time, I was very political, I still am. A lot of my heroes were Catholics who were working for the poor or for social change. A lot of nuns, Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic worker movement, Thomas Merton, who was a spiritual kind of activist and a poet, the Berrigan brothers, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, who were Jesuits, I believe. And I really admired them because they turned their faith into action. And I thought, that seemed really natural to me.
Okay.
So that's why I decided, maybe this is for me.
And how long did that last, and were you able to take anything from it?
Well, I was in the seminary for 8 years. Yeah. So I got a really great education and gave me some discipline, and I sorely needed it. And then I was a priest for 3 years. So all told, in that world, I was there for 12 years.
What did you preach?
I don't know. I mean, I would preach.
Or did you have a host church where you started out then?
Yeah, and then I remember my whole way of being is that on Monday mornings, which were my days off, I would read the readings for next Sunday. So I had all week to think about what I wanted to say, because I didn't write out my sermons. I thought them out, and I had them in my head. because I thought about it, which is interesting because that's what I do with my stories. I have them all in my head and I keep them there. And then when it comes time to write, it seems like I'm just like, ooh, that's coming quickly, but it's not. It's just the last step in the process.
It's been lingering
It's
there
been lingering
already.
there. And so I used to have the first line of my sermon. I knew what I wanted to talk about. I'd have an anecdote. I could relate it back to the readings of the week. And it really taught me to be a public speaker and to focus in on the message and what I wanted to say with the message. And I never had trouble coming up with a topic for the sermon. Something inevitably would happen during the week that I could say, oh, I can include that in the sermon, because then people could relate to it because it was a part of everyday living.
So it sounds like your time in the priesthood just led naturally to you pursuing a career as a writer.
Actually, it did. It seems like rather a crooked path, but actually it was quite natural, well, at least for me.
Yeah. And did you know when you left the priesthood, I'm going to be a writer?
Yes.
Tell me about that. How did you know?
I'd always wanted to be a writer, actually. When I was discerning what I wanted to do with my life and what my passions were, it wasn't the priesthood. And I knew where it lay. It lay all my passions for reading, writing, and I thought I really would like to become a writer. But I didn't know anything about how one did that.
And so I imagine was it a tough road?
It was. And it was a lonely road. And it still is. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that one thing that the seminary teaches you, it teaches you about prayer and being still. And you can't do that if you don't learn how to spend time alone. Because you can't meditate and pray or even just process your life and theology if you can't be alone. And the first thing a writer has to learn is how to be alone. And I already knew how to do that.
Well, let's talk about this book then. It won this big award just a few weeks ago, the Faulkner Award. Tell us the title of the book and tell us what it's about.
Well, I wrote a book of short stories. Everything begins and ends at the Kentucky Club. And I had thought a lot about it. And I had really a lot of the stories in my head. I wrote the first one, and then it got published. And then I thought, okay, because I hadn't written a story in 20 years.
A short story?
A short story in 20 years. Because my first book was a book of poems. My second book was a collection of short stories. And then I was off to the races with novels and poetry and young adult novels. And a story? I mean, I didn't even know that I remembered how to write one. And I remember thinking, I was teaching a class on the art of the short story. And I thought to myself, well, do I know how to write one? Do I have a right to teach this if I don't know how to write one?
Right.
And so I wrote the first one, and I decided I'm going to do a collection of short stories. But I wanted them to be all different and stand on their own. But I wanted the reader to be reminded that somehow all of these stories belong together. And that reminder was the Kentucky Club.
So tell us about the Kentucky Club. What is, for those of us that don't know, what is the Kentucky Club and where is it?
Well, since Prohibition, it's been around. And it was a big watering hole for people. And it wasn't the nicest one at the time, because there was a lot of really elegant watering holes.
And this is where?
In Avenida Juárez, which was the strip. Everybody in El Paso would go out to dinner, they'd get dressed up, they'd go to bars, they'd go to dinner, because it's beginning with Prohibition. Mm-hmm. And there was no liquor.
In
But
the
we didn't-
United
In the
States.
United States, people in El Paso didn't care. They would just go to Juarez. There would be singers in some of the bars. I mean, nightclub singers. I knew this woman named Nina Bayham. She's Jewish. She came from New York, and she was a chanteuse in one of those nightclubs. And I remember, may she rest in peace, when I went to her funeral, there was a picture of her. And she was in a backless dress, and she was looking like this. And it was like, in those days. So it was kind of elegant. It was kind of a scene. It kind of got less elegant, but you have to remember that the liquor laws in Texas were very strict, and they didn't loosen up until the 70s, because it was dry. And then there was a law passed that each county could decide. And only then, but nobody cared. So they would just go to Juarez, they did it in El Paso. So the Kentucky Club is kind of an emblem of that era. And it's one of the few bars that has survived, because so many of them have all shut down.
Right.
And they've opened new ones, but this one has lasted. So it's the last, and it's got this, beautiful mahogany bar. It's a little faded, but you can tell it had its day.
Right, that it was an elegant place. And so why did you, what role does it play in the book?
Well, because it's a bar that belongs to both sides of the border. People in El Paso talk about the Kentucky Club as if it's in El Paso. I mean, yeah.
Like it's their neighborhood bar.
Right. And maybe younger people don't, but even younger people. I know that my stepdaughter's generation, that's where they used to go hang out in Juarez. I mean, it's different kinds of people adopted it as theirs, different generations. When I was growing up, you could go to the Kentucky Club and you could get your tickets there to the bullfight.
Right.
And there's all these stories about it. The margarita was said to have been invented there,
Was said to
but a
have
lot
been.
of people claim that.
Sure.
A bar in Tijuana claims that.
Sure.
But
So-
I'd like to think it was the Kentucky Club.
So, but the Kentucky Club the book isn't about the Kentucky Club,
It's not.
right? So tell us about the stories that we can find in the book. There are themes, there are love stories, there are stories about drug addiction, and there are stories, I think the stories that I recall most are the stories where the characters are struggling with their own identity and struggling to either figure out or accept who they are.
Right.
Why do you choose those themes? Why?
Because they lived their lives in a kind of damnation in some ways. Sometimes of their own making, sometimes not. They don't control their own worlds, and they feel trapped. And I think that they struggle to become good people, and they struggle with their own demons, and they're just right. They work so hard, and then they fall short a little bit. They're just this side of salvation. Yeah, that's the old priest in me talking, right? But it's true. I think that people struggle with their demons, and sometimes their demons kill them, and sometimes they manage to survive their demons. And I wanted to talk about the specific demons that exist on the border, because what happens with the border is that it's in the news. Juarez is in the news. El Paso is in the news because of Juarez, and the contrast between them. And they're just headlines. And yet, people live those headlines. And I wanted to talk about the border, not from the headlines perspective, but from people who live with drugs, use them, are destroyed by them, sell them. It's not as if drugs are just about drug lords. There's a lot of, even small-time dealers, they're just victims. They're small fry. They're trying to make a living. You can judge it. You can say, that's terrible. You can do all of those things. A writer's job isn't to judge. A writer's job is to have compassion for his characters and try to represent them to other people and say, look, this is actually the real story. I may be making up the stories, but in a sense I'm not. These stories are real.
And so you draw your inspiration from the actual reality that people on the border live day to day, every day.
Every day. Every day. And it's a wondrous, I love the border. It's wondrous and awesome and inspiring. And it's cruel and violent. It's all of those things.
What has been people's response? People, say, who are not from the border to this book.
People's response has been amazing. It really has been amazing.
I mean, just the fact that it won this huge award, right, which we should say that the Faulkner has been around for some 30 years now, right? And it's a peer-reviewed contest, right, where
other writers judge it.
Other writers are judging writers' work, and it's open. There's no fee to apply and submit the book. And so out of 351 entries from all over the country, you know, this book was selected, right? So that's got to say a little bit.
I'm still stunned by that. I am. I have to be honest.
Yeah, and I think Cinco Puntos Press, which is in El Paso, right, that is the publisher of the book. I mean, they're a small independent publisher run by a family. There's 3 of them that run it full time, and they're just as surprised and delighted as you are, right, about it.
Yeah, but I think it's about. There's so many compelling stories on the border. And so you have to bring those stories and you have to put it together with your craft. And I think in many ways, these stories are very mature. They're about, if you read it, it's someone, this guy didn't start writing yesterday. I've grown in my craft and in my art. And I've learned how to wed my material to my writing. And I think that's what makes it a compelling book, both of those elements together.
Well, would you do us the honor of reading an excerpt from the book so we can get a little taste?
This is from The Herding Game, and it's the main character, Michael, is a high school counselor.
Okay.
I was busy counseling kids. Some of them messed up as hell, wounded. Some of them just wanting advice on where to go to college. Some of them just wanting someone to talk to because they were already old and tired from being made invisible by the adults around them. And that's just a little passage, but it's true. I think that I do have an insight into kids, and we do make them invisible. We do, because we don't take their problems seriously. And yet, at that time of life, it's a very serious business, their lives, and they could go one way or the other. And I think, I really think that this character here really thinks a lot about his students, but he doesn't think of himself as a good person necessarily. He certainly doesn't overrate himself. He just thinks, he's the kind of guy that says, I'm a high school counselor. That's my job. I shouldn't get extra credit for doing my job. And yet, we the readers see that this guy is really a lovely man and committed. And he has a bigger heart than he gives himself credit for.
So is there an overall message that you're trying to send with this book?
Well, all of the characters, not all of them, but many of them find themselves in a most desperate situation. And yet not one of them despairs. And there's only one story where the character Carmen, she overdoses on heroin. One gets the feeling that she didn't die despairing, that it's just the addiction took her over. But I think my characters, no matter what the hurt is, no matter what they suffered, they find despair unacceptable because they really do hope for a better day. They, as damaged as they can be, there is something in them that understands that they are far better than their worst moments.
Very good. Well, just to wrap up, tell us what's next for you. Are you writing something else? Are you taking a break?
I don't take a break from writing. It's not what I do. I love writing. I think writing really has saved my life, and it keeps me alive. And it keeps me sharp, and it keeps me thoughtful, and it keeps me involved in the world because I'm in tune with it. I watch, I listen. And I'm writing two novels right now, a young adult novel and an adult novel. And both of them, one of them is set, the young adult novel is set in El Paso and Las Cruces, and then the adult novel is set in El Paso. But then, I'm taking a break from the border after I finish those. I'm going this summer to do research in Spain, and I'm going to write a novel with the Spanish Civil War as its background.
Very good. Well, we'll look forward to reading that when you're all finished, and I wish you good luck, and I thank you for coming on the show as my guest. This has been Fronteras, A Changing America, and I'm Mónica Ortiz Uribe. Thank you, and have a good night.